maps for centuries, then vanished as if they had never existed. No recorded battle, no signed treaty to mark their end, no clear explanation at all. Just century by century, the letters on the map faded away, replaced by new ones, till the memory of them sank completely into oblivion. Tartaria. The name once appeared in the journals of merchants, in the reports of explorers, and on intricately drawn old maps, and yet today it survives only as a faint ink stain in archives or as a folk tale dismissed as myth. Who decided to erase it? And more importantly, what was so dangerous about it that it had to disappear? The traces that remain are scattered, strange buildings tucked away in modern cities, identical architectural styles across far-flung continents, and old maps clearly marked with a name history now pretends it never knew. Put all those pieces together, and the picture looks nothing like what you were taught in school. Tonight, on this special episode of Bedtime History, we're going to follow those fading marks on the map, through layers of dust and centuries of silence, to uncover a secret the world has kept quiet for over 100 years. Before the name Tartaria was boldly etched onto 16th century maps, it existed in a far more elusive form, not as a clearly defined territory with neat borders, but as scattered notes, sometimes just a few lines in ancient chronicles stretching from east to west. This was a time when geography was still a blend of first-hand knowledge and imagination, of actual journeys and rumors carried by traveling merchants. From the east, Tang and Song dynasty, Chinese records spoke of distant lands far to the north and northwest, home to nomadic tribes who lived on horseback, hunted, and moved with the seasons. They called them That Gyat, Jot Quiet, later Mongols, and other names depending on the era. In works like the New Book of Tang or the History of Song, these lands were described as harsh in climate, with winters so long that snow and ice covered the ground for most of the year, yet also rich in furs, minerals, and horses renowned for their stamina. While they never used the word Tartaria, these descriptions match closely with the region that would later bear that name on European maps. Further west, the Islamic world also left its accounts. In the works of 12th century al-Idrisi and in Persian and Arab chronicles, we find descriptions of Tatar or Turk tribes in the far north, living on endless steppes linked by trade routes that followed great rivers and lakes. They were portrayed as fierce warriors who were as skilled in trade as in conquest, able to move armies across vast distances in short periods of time, a trait that made them both feared and respected. In Europe, medieval Latin manuscripts written by monks and scholars often recorded the stories of merchants or envoys who had ventured into the lands beyond the known world. To them, this was a place of mystery, sometimes tied to religious legends like Gog and Magog, two biblical nations said to be imprisoned behind massive walls, awaiting the day they would break free and sweep across the earth. Some medieval Mappamundi maps depicted the region as a vast blank space in the far north, dotted with illustrations of horsemen armed with bows and strange walled cities unlike anything in Christendom. What's striking is that despite coming from very different cultures and timelines, these records converge on certain key points: the staggering size of the territory, the deep bond between its people and the horse, their skill in warfare, and the existence of organized settlements, far from the image of entirely scattered nomadic bands. Such details suggest that amid the endless grasslands there may have been trading hubs or centers of power significant enough to leave a strong impression on outsiders. At this stage, Tartaria was not yet a formal geographic term. Each culture had its own name for it, shaped by their perspective and the extent of their contact. But when we piece the fragments together, we begin to see the outline of a shared space, a vast land spanning much of northern Eurasia, serving both as a natural barrier and as a bridge between East and West. Then came the 13th century, and history itself shifted. A military upheaval threw open the gates to this vast land, transforming it from a distant mystery into a direct player in the global balance of power. It was at this point that the name Tatars began to spread beyond scattered mentions. Political and military upheavals across Eurasia pushed this once vague region into the very center of recorded history. And now Tatars, and later Tartars, became more than a geographic label. They became an image that burned itself into the collective memory, half rooted in history, half in legend. In Europe's eyes, their emergence was tied to the conquests of the Mongol Empire. When the cavalry of Genghis Khan and his descendants swept across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, most Westerners, unable to distinguish between the many tribes, lumped them all under one name: Tartars. The second R was likely a European addition, maybe to differentiate the name, maybe simply a mispronunciation, but it had an unintended effect. It made the word sound like Tartarus, the deep abyss of punishment in Greek mythology. That association alone gave the name an even darker edge. The chronicles of the time, from England's Matthew Paris to the Franciscan envoy Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, are filled with descriptions both factual and fantastical. Armies on horseback, moving like the wind, shooting with deadly precision from the saddle, bound together by iron discipline, cities besieged and leveled in days, entire regions emptied of inhabitants. Yet mixed among these fearful images are notes about their strict military organization, relay stations for messengers, and road networks linking major centers of power, details that didn't match the purely barbarian image many Europeans preferred to believe. Alongside history, folklore began weaving its own image of the Tatars. In European tales, they were warriors from the edge of the world, passing through icy gates or deadly deserts. Some stories credited them with supernatural gifts. Swords that never rusted, fortresses that could never be taken, the ability to cross impossible distances without rest. Even exaggerated, these tales reveal the deep impression they left behind. In the Middle East and Persia, Islamic chroniclers like Juwayni and Rashid al-Din recorded a mix of horror and awe. Whether as victims or witnesses, they could not deny the efficiency and discipline of the northern armies. They wrote of bustling trade towns, massive tent encampments able to house thousands, and the ability to set up temporary infrastructure almost instantly wherever they advanced. Interestingly, in many later European maps and documents, the name Tatars gradually shifted into Tartaria, used to label the homeland of these armies. This change, from the name of a people to the name of a vast territory, shows how the human mind tries to frame the unknown, giving a single label to an enormous, undefined space so it can be remembered and retold. And once that label became tied to such powerful images, whether rooted in fact or myth, it outlived the very figures who inspired it. From that moment on, Tartaria was more than just a spot on the map. It carried an implication. This was the land of undefeated warriors, of cities hidden beyond the steppe and mountains, of a power both real and legendary. And it was this image that would form the foundation for how the region would be drawn, in ever greater detail, in the centuries to come, until it reached its full prominence on the maps of the world. In the Middle Ages, when Europe's sails had only just begun to venture beyond the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, the world in the Western mind was still a painting with large, unfilled spaces. The blank spots on a map weren't just unexplored territory, they were mirrors reflecting the imagination of the map maker. In that imagined landscape, the homeland of the Tatar armies, later called Tartaria, emerged as a colossal space, far beyond any familiar scale. Missionaries, merchants, and envoys returning from their rare journeys into East or Central Asia spoke of endless distances, of riding for a week on horseback and still not passing the horizon. They told of steppes stretching like oceans, mountain ranges rising like fortress walls, and rivers so wide it could take a full day to cross. To Europeans accustomed to lands fractured by feudal borders, the idea of a single, continuous expanse stretching thousands of miles felt almost unreal. Many Mappa Mundi maps from the 13th and 14th centuries depicted this region as a great mass in the far north and northeast of the known world, often decorated with illustrations of walled cities, strange domed rooftops, and mounted warriors. While geographically inaccurate, these drawings show that Europeans were beginning to picture the area as a unified entity with its own social structure and architectural style. The mix of fact passed along through the stories of travelers, and myth created an image that was half real, half imagined, with no clear boundary between the two. From the east, Chinese and Korean sources also describe these outer regions as vast lands inhabited by many different groups, yet still featuring centers of concentrated power. Records spoke of marketplaces, trade routes stretching from the western regions all the way to Siberia, and fortified strongholds rising from the grasslands, all suggesting this was no empty void, but a wide-reaching network sustained by a balance of migration, commerce, and military force. For Europeans of the time, information from the East arrived slowly, often distorted by layers of translation. Yet the repetition of certain details gradually gave Tartaria a more defined shape, a territory that could contain many climates, many peoples, and many forms of settlement, but still fit within a single overarching framework, one they could only understand by comparing it to the largest empires they knew. And yet, this very vagueness was dangerous. When information was scarce and scattered, imagination had plenty of room to grow. Thus, alongside tales of thriving cities came stories of cannibal tribes, colossal beasts, and mountains hiding golden cities. No one could be sure what was real and what was fantasy, but one thing was certain. In the medieval European mind, Tartaria was too vast, too distant, and too alien to fully comprehend. These early depictions would become the foundation for everything that followed. As expeditions multiplied and more detailed maps appeared from the 13th century onward, the image of Tartaria would slowly step out of the realm of legend and onto the pages of cartographers, detailed enough to seem an unquestioned part of the world map, at least until it was erased centuries later. The 13th century opened a new chapter for the entire Eurasian continent. The military campaigns of Genghis Khan and his descendants united lands that had once been scattered, forging them into a single, vast political space. The Mongol Empire didn't just expand borders, it opened trade routes, lines of communication, and systems of governance that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the eastern shores of Europe. It was in this context that the name Tartaria began to take a firm place on European maps, no longer the vague concept it had been in earlier centuries. When Marco Polo left Venice and ventured deep into Asia, he passed through lands that almost no one in the West had ever seen. In his accounts, he described bustling cities, massive fortresses, and a chain of relay stations along the road, where messengers and merchants could change horses, rest, and continue on their way. These reports, coloured though they were by his own perspective, helped reshape European perception. Behind the name Tartaria lay not only empty steppe, but a sprawling network of settlements and administration. Cartographers of the time, working from Marco Polo's stories and the reports of other envoys and traders, began to draw Tartaria with newfound confidence. In maps from the 14th to 16th centuries, the region was often shaded as a massive block, sometimes taking up nearly half of Asia. Maps like Fra Maurao's world map, the Catalan Atlas, and later editions of Ptolemy's Geographia showed Tartaria dotted with named cities, major rivers, and long mountain ranges, proof that information had become far more specific than the blank spaces of earlier maps. Notably, the land was often divided into zones such as Tartaria Magna, Great Tartaria, Tartaria Moscovita, Muscovite Tartaria, Tartaria Chinensis, Chinese Tartaria, and Tartaria Independent, Independent Tartaria. This reflected reality. After the Mongol Empire fractured, its former territories still shared cultural, commercial, and technological links, though they were ruled by different political entities. In the European mind, all of these parts still belonged to a single, geocultural whole they simply called Tartaria. Tartaria's appearance on maps often came with illustrations showing distinctive architecture and ways of life, grand domes, pointed towers, circular yurts, and disciplined ranks of cavalry. This was the moment when imagery became just as important as geography. Maps weren't only records of location, but also narratives about the power and strangeness of a land at the edge of Europe's understanding. For the political centers of the West, putting Tartaria on the map carried meaning beyond cartography. It signaled that the world had been recorded and named, that these distant lands now lay within the sphere of interest and ambition of the great powers. A map became not just a tool for describing the world, but for shaping how people thought about it. And once the name Tartaria occupied a vast space on the page, it became a default part of shared knowledge. Yet these very maps also planted a seed for the future. Once people grew accustomed to seeing Tartaria as a massive, unified presence, its disappearance a few centuries later would leave a puzzling void. A void that later generations looking back would have to ask, what truly happened to make a name so familiar on the world's maps vanish without a trace? But in this period, Tartaria was still at its height. Merchants, explorers, and diplomats continued to write, trade, and return with fresh stories about the land. Those stories would circulate across Europe, layering image upon legend, setting the stage for a time when Tartaria would stand not just as a swath of color on a map, but as an idea bound up with wealth, power, and mysteries that would never be fully explained. As the overland Silk Road routes grew more secure under the Mongol Empire and its successors, European merchants and envoys began setting foot in lands they had once only heard about in legends. The stories they brought back were not just trade reports, but vivid images of a world the West had long imagined as distant and savage. To them, Tartaria was no longer a blank space on the map. It had cities, fortresses, and complex, diverse communities. Italian, Polish, and Russian merchants spoke of market towns strung along the trade arteries, where caravans carrying furs, spices, gemstones, and fine crafts converged. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva, though belonging to different kingdoms and khanates, appeared in European accounts as part of the greater Tartarian sphere. They were described with monumental gates, high brick walls, and bustling central bazaars where merchants from China, Persia, and even distant Europe mingled. Some Western explorers, like England's Anthony Jenkinson or Russian envoys of the 16th and 17th centuries, wrote of massive fortresses guarding strategic points, perched on high hills, along riverbanks, or rising out of the steppe. These structures were more than defensive positions. They were way stations, tax collection points, and protective hubs for traveling merchants. Many reports noted the strong sense of order, gate guards, storage warehouses, and even water systems within the walls. One detail that fascinated outsiders was the architectural mix. In a single city, one might see Islamic-style domes, tall European-style bell towers, and wooden nomadic dwellings. This blending spoke of centuries of cultural exchange, and it puzzled many Western observers. How could lands considered beyond the edges of European civilization display such richness and refinement? As for the population, accounts often emphasized diversity. Alongside Turkic and Mongol-speaking nomadic tribes were long-settled communities speaking multiple languages and practicing different faiths: Islam, Buddhism, Orthodox Christianity, and even Jewish communities engaged in trade and skilled crafts. This mosaic of cultures enriched the image of Tartaria, portraying it as a crossroads rather than a single, monolithic land. For Western mapmakers and scholars, information from merchants and explorers was invaluable for filling in the blank spaces on paper. The more city names, fortress descriptions, rivers, and routes they collected, the more tangible and real Tartaria became in the European imagination. And each time a new map was drawn, the name Tartaria was reinforced yet again as an indispensable part of global knowledge. But this richness also planted another seed, the seed of mystery. Many of the cities, fortresses, and architectural marvels described in those old records have since vanished without a trace, or survive only under new names with no connection to Tartaria as a concept. To understand why, we have to move into the next stage, when the architecture and technology of this land became the subject of fierce debate, offering tantalizing clues to a bigger question: just how advanced did Tartaria truly become? Western merchants and explorers who wrote about Tartaria didn't stop at describing its cities, fortresses, and bustling markets. Many were captivated by the architectural and technical details they encountered, features which, if their accounts were accurate, went far beyond what Europe of the time thought a distant and uncivilized land could achieve. Some reports spoke of enormous domed structures, their spans stretching dozens of meters, built from stone or fired brick, so precisely joined that the seams were nearly invisible. There were towering spires capped with metal that gleamed in the sun, reflecting light from miles away. Massive stone bridges crossed wide rivers, their long spans and perfectly shaped arches drawing comparisons to ancient Roman works. And in some cases, observers claimed, they were even more refined. Public works drew equal attention. Travelers described vast bathhouses with separate hot and cold water systems piped through ceramic or metal conduits buried beneath the floors. Some mentioned assembly halls lit from high circular windows set into the walls, creating spaces that were bright yet cool even in summer heat. Remarkably, these techniques weren't confined to a few major cities. They appeared repeatedly across different parts of Tartaria, as if they all followed a shared architectural blueprint. Perhaps most intriguing were structures whose purpose Westerners couldn't explain. Accounts tell of towers or metal columns mounted on rooftops, connected to other metal frameworks resembling some kind of transmission system. Some guessed they were lightning rods, others imagined a form of signaling or even energy transfer technology. Though no direct evidence survives, such descriptions have fueled later speculation that Tartaria may once have possessed technical systems far more advanced than we assume. Beyond architecture, some accounts hinted at remarkable material craftsmanship. Fortress walls and domes made from bronze alloys that kept their luster for decades, timber treated to resist decay, and fired bricks with uniform color and incredible durability. These details have led some modern researchers to suspect that Tartarian architecture rested on a foundation of technical knowledge either lost to time or deliberately omitted from mainstream history. For Europeans of the era, encountering such works in a land they had long imagined as the edge of civilization was both astonishing and unsettling. While many maps and books continued to portray Tartaria as a vast, untamed expanse, eyewitnesses described a place capable of organization, construction, and innovation on par with, if not surpassing, parts of the West. It was these images carried back across Europe that made Tartaria at once mysterious and formidable. No longer just an unnamed stretch of land on the map, it became a distinct entity with its own recognizable architectural and technical signature, easy to identify but difficult to explain. And from here, as the centuries passed, those structures would become vital clues for later generations seeking traces of a civilization that may have been erased from official memory. As the reports of merchants and explorers were gathered and compared, one striking detail began to emerge. No matter where you looked, from the Central Asian steppe, the frozen lands of Siberia, the cities of Eastern Europe, or even remote settlements farther afield, the major structures seemed to share a near-universal architectural language. People began calling it the Tartarian style, not because there was an official record naming it so, but because of the uncanny repetition of features too distinct to overlook. The most immediately recognizable feature was the dome, not the half-sphere of Roman tradition, but onion-shaped or elongated cylindrical domes, rising with perfect proportional balance. These domes were often set atop tall bases, richly decorated in multiple layers, sometimes gilded or painted in vivid colors. From a distance, they stood out like landmarks on the horizon, projecting both majesty and otherness. Accompanying the domes were slender spires, sometimes freestanding like massive lampposts, sometimes attached to the main structure, soaring high and ending in a sharp metal point or geometric ornament. In many cases, these spires were connected by metal or stone frameworks, creating a unified composition. To modern eyes, they could resemble energy collectors or transmission devices. To people of the time, they were symbols of power and refined craftsmanship. Another often overlooked element, but one that later architects and engineers noticed, was proportion. Tartarian buildings appeared to follow strict geometric principles. Whether church, palace, or town hall, the symmetry between height, width, and decorative detail was so precise it bordered on perfection. Measurements taken by later researchers often revealed recurring relationships to special numbers, such as the golden ratio or ancient geometric constants. What astonished observers most was the reach of this style. In Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan, it was obvious, but it could also be found in Warsaw, Istanbul, and even further afield in structures in San Francisco, Chicago, Sydney, and Melbourne. Many buildings in former colonial territories of Britain, France, Russia, and the United States shared unmistakable traits: domes, spires, grand arched entrances, and flawlessly symmetrical facades. Mainstream explanations for this widespread appearance point to migration and the spread of European architectural influence. Yet the question lingers: why did the exact same style appear almost simultaneously in cities half a world apart, many of them built within the same narrow time frame, and why were some of the details so identical it was as if they came from a single master blueprint? Some alternative researchers suggest that these structures are remnants of a unified civilization that existed before being broken apart by geopolitical upheavals or natural disasters. Even when renovated or redated to later centuries, they argue, the surviving buildings still carry the original design signature of that earlier era. They see the sheer global presence of this style as one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Tartaria was not just a name on a map, but a far-reaching urban architectural network. Of course, the idea remains controversial. Academic historians insist that lumping every dome and spire structure into Tartaria oversimplifies history. Yet even they cannot entirely explain away the remarkable design and proportional similarities among these buildings. And for those seeking traces of a hidden past, this very repetition feels like a clue. A common architectural language still standing today, even though the name of its parent civilization has been erased from official records. From here, the next question becomes unavoidable. If Tartaria truly left its architectural imprint across the world, how did it build and sustain such works? The answer leads us into bold theories about the energy systems, technologies, and infrastructure this civilization might once have commanded. If the domes and spires of Tartarian architecture could catch the eye from miles away, the technical mysteries hidden inside those same buildings were what kept seasoned observers thinking long after. Beneath their grand exteriors, many of these structures retained features that raised a provocative question. Were they simply the products of great craftsmanship, or once part of a sophisticated system whose operation we have long since forgotten? One particularly curious detail is the recurring presence of metal poles, sharp-tipped finials, or antenna-like structures mounted atop domes and tall spires. In mainstream architectural explanations, these are usually described as decorative elements, or occasionally as lightning rods. But to some independent researchers, their positioning and form suggest the potential to collect or transmit some form of energy, perhaps atmospheric electricity, a concept explored centuries later by scientists like Nikola Tesla. The theory is bold, but it becomes harder to dismiss when you see nearly identical features repeated across hundreds of buildings spread half a world apart. Heating systems inside Tartarian buildings raise similar questions. In many structures, particularly in harsh climates like Siberia or Eastern Europe, there are complex air ducts and ventilation channels embedded under floors or within walls, designed to distribute warmth evenly through multiple rooms. Some even feature heated floors, reminiscent of the Roman hypocaust system, but on a larger scale and integrated deeply into the building's core design. If this was purely a local innovation, why did it appear in so many cities with layouts so strikingly similar? Equally impressive were their water systems. In some areas once considered part of Tartaria, excavations have uncovered ceramic or metal pipes running deep beneath the ground, directly connected to large reservoirs located within or beneath public buildings. These water sources didn't just serve basic needs, they seemed tied to regulating a building's temperature, a form of climate control we usually associate with modern technology. Certain ruins even hint at the ability to store and manage energy. Some contain underground chambers lined with conductive materials, shaped like machine rooms or control centers. While the evidence is not yet conclusive, such findings raise the possibility that Tartarian cities may have functioned as interconnected networks, with buildings linked through a shared technical infrastructure. Mainstream academia approaches these ideas cautiously, often labeling them as overinterpretations or misreadings of ancient remains. Independent researchers counter that without considering such possibilities, it's difficult to explain how so many Tartarian structures could endure for centuries with minimal decay, even in extreme weather conditions. Debate aside, one fact stands out. Tartarian architecture wasn't just aesthetically remarkable, it carried technical features that seemed to exceed the standards of the era to which it is officially assigned. When you look at a single building in isolation, it's easy to dismiss Tartarian architectural and technical traits as just hallmarks of a certain era. But when you line up multiple cities on a map, stretching from Moscow, Kazan, and Irkutsk to Warsaw, Istanbul, and even San Francisco or Melbourne, an unavoidable question arises. How could places separated by thousands of kilometers, even across different continents, share nearly the exact same architectural code? Onion-shaped domes, soaring spires, perfectly symmetrical facades, unusually wide and tall arched doorways, and intricate repeating decorative motifs. These weren't just broad stylistic similarities. The proportions themselves, the height of towers, the curve of domes, the dimensions of windows, often matched with uncanny precision. Such uniformity is hard to explain solely through architectural influence or aesthetic trends, which typically vary from region to region. Some of these cities also shared strikingly similar urban layouts, a central square dominated by a grand domed building, radiating streets arranged on a symmetrical axis, flanked by public institutions like libraries, theatres, or city halls, all positioned in a pattern so consistent that, when diagrammed, their plans looked almost interchangeable, as if drawn from the same master blueprint. Even in cities where the original architecture no longer stands, the foundations and street grids still reflect this order. Then there are the subtler details you might miss on a casual glance: half-buried windows at ground level, metal spires crowning towers, or ornate patterns with complex geometric symbolism. When comparing 19th century photographs of cities in Russia, Europe, North America, and Australia, these shared traits become even more obvious, as if an unseen hand had stamped the same design template onto each location. Mainstream architectural history tends to explain this as the result of neoclassical and Byzantine revival movements spreading through trade, colonization, and shared cultural exchange. But this explanation struggles to satisfy those who note the consistency goes beyond style, extending into technical elements like ventilation systems, water channels, and even foundation construction. And why do these buildings, regardless of location, often display a durability far exceeding what would be expected from the official dates assigned to them? A bold hypothesis has emerged that all these cities were once part of the same network, a global or semi-global civilization with shared technical and aesthetic standards. When that civilization disappeared or was replaced, its buildings were repurposed and assigned new dates, sometimes with minor modifications to fit a rewritten historical narrative. Adding weight to this theory is a peculiar phenomenon found in many such buildings. The ground floors are partially or completely buried beneath today's street level. Windows sit at ankle height, main entrances require stepping down, and in some cases entire floors lie hidden below ground. This isn't an isolated occurrence. It appears consistently across cities worldwide. Such clues have led independent researchers to the mud flood theory, the idea that sometime in the 18th or 19th century, a massive event buried the foundations of countless buildings and may have erased much of Tartaria's physical footprint. Before drawing conclusions, we need to move to the next stage of the story, to examine mud flood itself, the evidence for it, and why it might be the key to understanding how an entire civilization could vanish from both maps and collective memory. Walk through the old districts of St. Petersburg, Moscow, or Kazan, and then compare photographs of the same locations taken more than a century ago. A strange detail emerges. Many buildings have rows of windows set at ankle height, or even lower than the street itself. Some of these windows are bricked up, others open into dark, enclosed spaces, as if they once belonged to a floor now buried beneath layers of earth and debris. And this isn't just a Russian curiosity. In European cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Vienna, and across the Atlantic in Boston, San Francisco, and even Sydney, the same phenomenon can be found. Often the buried portion of the wall still carries full decorative detail. Carved mouldings, patterned brickwork, even doorways that have long since been sealed. No one in their right mind would lavish such effort on a section of a building that was meant to be underground from the start, unless, when it was built, the ground level stood lower than it does now. And that's exactly what raises the question. What happened to make the earth rise and swallow an entire floor? Early 20th century photographs deepen the mystery. Some show streets being excavated, revealing bright, fully finished lower levels with intact windows and doors. In St. Petersburg, there's an image of workers standing on the new street surface while below them, the so-called basement windows open onto a large, airy space, clearly the original ground floor. In America, photos taken after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire reveal buildings with a full, submerged level, exposed when the ground was disturbed. Across Europe, this isn't limited to major cities. In small towns, many older houses now have their original first floors functioning as basements. Speak with residents or homeowners, and you sometimes hear the same story. During renovations, they discovered staircases leading down to these basements, stairs that were actually the original main entrances, now half buried. In a few cases, traces of old signage or house numbers can still be seen, now lying below the modern street surface. The mainstream explanation points to gradual build-up over centuries, trash, soil, and road repair layers slowly raising street level. But proponents of the mud flood theory counter that such a process would be uneven and take a long time, whereas in many cities the half-buried phenomenon appears uniformly and at nearly the same elevation. That kind of consistency, they argue, suggests a sudden, large-scale event rather than slow accumulation. Independent researchers also point to additional clues: lower wall sections below street level bearing erosion marks, dried mud deposits, or distinct color changes compared to the upper facade. These, they suggest, could be the residue of a fast-moving surge of earth and mud sweeping through streets and leaving behind thick layers of sediment that entombed the lower parts of buildings. If that were the case, the consequences would go far beyond lost living space. Such an event could have erased large portions of infrastructure, technology, and physical evidence of a prior civilization. Once the foundations and ground floors were buried, any integrated technical systems, water pipes, heating ducts, metal fixtures, would vanish from sight, fading from memory in the generations that followed. The photographs, sketches, and written descriptions of this half-buried architecture from Russia, Europe, and the Americas are not definitive proof of a global mud flood. But they do raise a fair question. If this was the result of a sudden disaster, when did it happen and what was its impact on Tartaria, if that civilization truly existed? To explore that, we'll need to look more closely at the mud flood hypothesis from both geological and historical perspectives, and at the traces of an event that might have left a worldwide imprint in the 18th or 19th century. As photographs of half-buried ground floors surfaced, from places as far apart as St. Petersburg and San Francisco, Warsaw and Melbourne, independent researchers began to ask, if this wasn't just a local phenomenon, could a single, large-scale event have struck multiple continents at roughly the same time? This is where the mud flood theory took shape. According to the hypothesis, sometime in the 18th or early 19th century, an unusual geological or climatic event unleashed massive flows of mud and sediment that surged across parts of the world. The force and speed of these flows were enough to sweep through cities, burying the lower stories of thousands of buildings, turning them into basements in a matter of hours or days. Supporters of the idea point to several possible causes: chains of volcanic eruptions, large-scale earthquakes triggering vast landslides, sudden and abnormal tectonic shifts, or extreme weather events that melted large volumes of ice, releasing torrents of mud and debris. Some even extend the speculation into the artificial, the possibility of an environmental weapon or a high-tech war whose record has been scrubbed from official history. One striking point is that many areas suspected to have been hit by a mud flood overlap with regions where Tartarian architecture is most evident. This leads to a secondary hypothesis. The event was not merely a natural disaster, but an erasure, wiping away much of the physical evidence of a civilization. In the aftermath, later generations rebuilt atop the remnants, redating the surviving structures and rewriting their origin stories. The evidence cited often includes 19th-century street excavation photographs showing lower floors with intact windows, doorways, and even signs of active use. There are also reports of fully formed building levels uncovered beneath layers of earth during foundation work, complete with architectural details and interior fittings, suggesting these were once main floors, not storage basements. Mainstream science rejects the idea of a global mud flood, attributing the buried floors to long-term sediment buildup, rising street levels, or urban redevelopment. Raising the ground to prevent flooding or adapt to new transportation systems, they argue, is a common and well-documented practice. But independent researchers counter, if this were purely local and gradual, why do we see the same effect at similar depths across so many cities on different continents, including those with no history of chronic flooding? Other unresolved questions linger. Why do so many late 19th and early 20th century photographs show cities being dug down rather than simply built up? Why are sewer and water systems in many cities located at depths that suggest the ground level was once significantly lower? And if a catastrophic event really did occur, what impact would it have had on the urban network we now associate with Tartaria? While no definitive answer exists, the mud flood has become an inseparable part of the Tartaria discussion, both as a proposed mechanism for the civilization's material disappearance and as its most controversial element. If true, it would mean modern history has either overlooked or deliberately concealed a global catastrophe that happened only a few centuries ago. To probe further, we'll need more tangible evidence. Photographs, drawings and excavation records from the 19th and 20th centuries, where traces of the mud flood might still be hiding in plain sight, preserved in black and white images that seem ordinary until you know what to look for. For a long time, the mud flood theory lived mainly in speculation, passed along through word of mouth and fueled by present-day observations of buried buildings. But photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries have given it a new dimension, direct visual evidence of cities being dug down rather than built up. These black and white images, originally taken to document urban renovations or major construction projects, now raise an unsettling question. Were we truly witnessing new construction, or the unearthing of something far older? In St. Petersburg, some photographs show streets being dug so deep that the entire lower levels of buildings are exposed, complete with windows, doors, and even staircases leading to what was once ground level. Workers stand at the bottom of freshly excavated roads, while above them the walls show signs of once being open to sunlight. Paintwork still visible, brickwork free of the damp staining you would expect in a true basement. In Moscow, similar images capture streets sitting well above the original entryways of older buildings. In some shots, newly built staircases lead up to raised entrances, while the original doors sit half-buried below. If this was simply the result of gradual street-level changes, why are the buried sections finished with the same precision as a main facade? Across Europe, in Prague, Vienna, and Warsaw, photographs show entire streets torn open, revealing lower levels with arched windows, decorative stonework, and even signage. At the time, these may have been mundane technical records or keepsakes. Now they serve another purpose, suggesting that many buildings we think were constructed in the 19th century may, in fact, have been far older, only freed from the earth during these so-called construction works. In the United States, post-1906 earthquake photographs of San Francisco reveal similar anomalies. As streets were leveled and debris cleared, numerous buildings were shown with ground floors sitting noticeably below the current street level, windows and doors partially buried. Archival images from late 19th century Chicago and Boston record deep excavations around major buildings, exposing lower sections that clearly weren't designed as basements. Even in Sydney and Melbourne, photographs from the early 20th century depict buildings with sub-levels revealed after dirt and stone were cleared away. This raises a critical question. Why did the same phenomenon appear in both the northern and southern hemispheres within roughly the same historical window? Mainstream explanations cite upgrades to sewer systems, raised roadbeds for flood control, and expanded transportation infrastructure. But to those who support the mud flood hypothesis, the timing, scale, and visual similarity of these scenes across multiple continents suggests something far more global than routine local improvements. When stripped from their original context, these photographs become powerful visual fragments of another possible story, one in which an entire layer of architecture was buried, only to be unearthed under the guise of modernization. And if a single event could bury so many structures worldwide, its consequences would likely extend far beyond the physical, potentially erasing infrastructure, technology, and material proof of Tartaria's existence. Once those buried levels were opened again, the questions naturally shifted, not only what buried them, but what vanished along with them. Technologies, urban systems, or artifacts that could have revealed Tartaria's true capabilities. From here, the narrative moves toward a turning point in the 19th century, when the name Tartaria began to shrink on maps, setting the stage for its near-total disappearance from the world's collective memory. If in the 17th and 18th centuries the name Tartaria sprawled across Asia on maps like a vast block of color, by the 19th century that picture began to change. Quietly, but with steady consistency, Tartaria's territory on official maps contracted year by year, decade by decade, like a great fabric being pulled into one corner until it vanished entirely. In the early 19th century editions, maps produced in Britain, France, Russia, and other major European cartographic centers still labeled Great Tartary or Grand Tartary, covering most of Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of East Asia. Yet only a few decades later, along with the appearance of new political borders, this once vast expanse began to fragment and be replaced by other names: Russian Empire, Chinese Empire, Kazakh Steppe, Turkestan, Mongolia. The portion labeled Tartaria was reduced to scattered remnants, pushed to the northern borders of China or the remote corners of Central Asia. What is striking is that this transformation was not tied to any clearly documented political event. There was no Tartarian War or Treaty of Dissolution. No formal declaration, no single historical milestone. It simply disappeared from maps, quietly but completely, as if it had never existed at all. Independent researchers point out that this cartographic shrinkage coincided with a series of other developments: the standardization of measurements, the adoption of maps based on precise longitude and latitude, and the publication of new international atlases. Under these new conventions, vague or hard-to-define entities like Tartaria were removed and replaced with more specific names that reflected the prevailing political structure. The result was that a once prominent fixture on world maps was reclassified into smaller parts, each absorbed into a recognized empire. Some historians interpret this as the natural progress of geographic science, phasing out outdated terminology. But to those who believe Tartaria was once a unified civilization, this process resembles a deliberate campaign, erasing the name in order to erase collective memory of a political and cultural entity no longer compatible with the rewritten historical narrative. Maps from the transitional period make the change clear. In some editions, the same area would shift within a decade from Great Tartary to Siberia or Russian Empire. In others, the remaining Tartaria label would be pushed east, reduced to a narrow strip between China and Russia before disappearing entirely in the closing decades of the century. It is no coincidence, they argue, that this era was also one of massive urban redevelopment, projects that could have masked or altered the appearance of older structures while assigning them fresh construction dates. Once buildings were classified as recently built, and the maps no longer bore the name Tartaria, the next generation would have little reason to suspect a vast civilization had once stood there. The disappearance of a name from a map is not just a change in vocabulary, it represents a shift in the lens through which the world is viewed. When a name stops appearing in print, it fades from speech, from textbooks, from memory. And once memory has been overwritten, restoring it becomes almost impossible. But maps tell only part of the story. Alongside this cartographic transformation came geopolitical upheavals, wars, annexations, and boundary redrawings among the European, Russian, and Chinese empires, conditions that created the perfect environment for history to be rewritten and the door to Tartaria's past to be quietly locked. The shrinking of Tartaria on 19th century maps did not occur in a political vacuum. This was an age when both Asia and Europe were shaken by wars, treaties, and territorial reconfigurations among the great empires. Russia, Qing China, and the European powers, particularly Britain and France, all sought to expand and consolidate control over lands that older maps had once labelled within the borders of Tartaria. In the north and northwest, the Russian Empire pressed a steady expansion deep into Siberia and Central Asia. Since the 17th century, they had established forts and trade routes along the Lena, Irtysh, and Amur rivers, but by the 19th century their aim was explicit: to transform these immense territories into direct imperial holdings. The conquest of the Central Asian Khanates, Kokand, Khiva, and Bukhara, in the 1860s to 1870s, brought both strategic advantage and the narrative authority for Russia to present itself as the legitimate successor to the lands once considered Tartaria. Once annexed, those territories would appear on international maps as part of the Russian Empire, erasing any trace of the older name. In the east, the Qing dynasty was also forced to redraw boundaries, following a series of border treaties with Russia. Most notably, the Treaty of Aigun, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, China ceded vast territories in Manchuria and Outer Mongolia. While these concessions diminished Qing territory, they simultaneously strengthened Russia's cartographic dominance and pushed the name Tartaria off the official publications of both empires. Within the remaining lands, the Qing enforced tight administrative control, renaming regions, imposing official terminology, and embedding in textbooks a historical narrative in which Tartaria had never existed as an independent political entity. To the south and southwest, the Great Game between Britain and Russia turned Afghanistan, the Himalayas, and the fringes of Central Asia into a strategic chessboard. This rivalry spurred the European powers to intensify surveying, mapping, and boundary making, eliminating vague territorial concepts. In the imperial mindset, there could be no man's land, or ambiguous names like Tartaria. Every stretch of ground had to belong to a defined political authority for negotiation and control. The Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, and the aggressive commercial penetration of China by Western powers further accelerated the geographic redefinition of the region. As both Russia and Britain produced maps for political and commercial purposes, the name Tartaria nearly vanished, replaced by clear-cut territorial divisions that served each empire's strategic agenda. Crucially, all of this unfolded during an era of modernizing global transport and communications. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the sea route through the Suez Canal, and the international telegraph network allowed empires not only to project physical control, but also to dominate the flow of information. When the new maps were printed in mass editions and distributed uniformly to schools, universities, and government offices, they fixed a new global consensus. Tartaria no longer existed, and had never existed, as an independent entity. For those who believe in the theory of a deliberate historical cover-up, this was the perfect moment to erase a civilization from collective memory. Territory was partitioned, names replaced, populations absorbed or relocated, and the historical narrative rewritten to fit the new power structure. Once the entire international map agreed on this updated version of history, restoring the recognition of Tartaria became an almost impossible task. By the time the 19th century's wars, conquests, and annexations had redrawn the world's political borders, the next stage in erasing Tartaria didn't take place on the battlefield. It happened instead on the draftsman's table, in the mapmaker's studios, and in the chambers of international standardization conferences. This was the moment when geography, surveying, and cartography entered the industrial age, and when a name could be made to vanish forever with the stroke of a pen and the precision of a measuring tool. Before the 19th century, world maps were largely the product of independent cartographic centers. Each empire or nation labeled, divided, and symbolized territories according to its own conventions. This allowed for the persistence of broad and loosely defined terms like Tartaria. But as the movement toward geographic standardization spread, such concepts began to be viewed as unscientific. A key turning point was the adoption of the global latitude-longitude grid anchored to the Greenwich meridian. Once every coordinate and border could be fixed with mathematical precision, the vague blanks on a map were filled with specific names, almost always tied to recognized political sovereignty. Tartaria, a geocultural designation with fluid borders, had no place in this new structure. International gatherings such as the First International Geographical Congress, Antwerp, 1871, and subsequent sessions played a decisive role. Here, cartographers, geologists, and government delegates agreed on standardized territorial names with a clear preference for the official administrative terms of existing empires. In these newly approved lists, Tartaria was gone, replaced by Siberia, Turkestan, Mongolia, Chinese Empire. Each area now fell into a precise legal and political framework documented with reliable sources, meaning the official records of the contemporary imperial powers. Standardization didn't just alter maps, it bled into textbooks, scholarly references, and the press. Once a term was removed from public education, it could vanish from collective memory within a generation or two. For school children of the late 19th century, Tartaria was reduced to a dusty, archaic word in rare old books, or worse, an error of history not worth mentioning. Industrial printing reinforced this erasure. As international atlases were mass-produced and distributed worldwide, the new Tartaria-free maps became the default reference. Within decades, older maps still bearing the name were consigned to archives, and unless someone deliberately sought them out, they faded into obscurity. Some independent researchers argue that this standardization phase was the true final blow to Tartaria's memory. Geological events or territorial conflicts could weaken a civilization, but only the removal of its name from official language could truly erase it. Without a name to call it by, history loses its anchor point, and that void is quickly filled by a more convenient narrative aligned with the new order. By the close of the 19th century, Tartaria had disappeared entirely from mainstream maps, replaced by a patchwork of clearly defined territories under the control of contemporary empires. On the surface, this was a triumph of scientific progress and administrative efficiency. But to those searching for suppressed history, it marks the moment when the memory of a vast entity, whether empire, confederation, or cultural network, but was frozen in the archives, leaving us with a historical gap we have yet to fill. From here, the story moves into a new phase, no longer about maps or borders, but about memory and knowledge itself. For to erase a civilization completely, changing its name is not enough. It must also be removed from books, libraries, and the shared consciousness of the people. This was the beginning of the stage that believers call the cover-up and rewriting of history, when archives, educational systems, and even academia joined in a silence that has now lasted more than a century. No gunfire, no grand proclamations, just inventory lists, reclassification orders, and small slips of paper pasted to the spines of books or rolled maps. Do not circulate, inaccurate, or obsolete reference. In many countries, especially the empires that had absorbed much of the old Tartarian domain, the 19th century was a period of sweeping reforms to national archives. Vast collections of older materials, including maps, travel journals, and reports from envoys or merchants, were systematically reviewed and sorted according to new standards. In this process, any document that used the term Tartaria or described entities no longer fitting the current political framework was quietly moved into restricted storage. These items weren't necessarily destroyed, but for the public, they might as well have been. They disappeared from catalogue listings, could no longer be borrowed, and could only be viewed with special authorization. In the great libraries of Europe and Russia, certain 17th to 18th century atlases that clearly marked Great Tartary were replaced with updated editions reflecting the new borders and names. The originals were placed in separate collections, sometimes rebound in new covers, so an ordinary reader would not recognize them as different from the widely available versions. In some cases, handwritten notes were added to the old maps. Historical designation no longer scientifically valid, a short line but enough to deter most researchers from pursuing it further. It wasn't just maps that vanished into the vaults. Manuscripts, explorers' journals, commercial records, and collections of landscape sketches met the same fate. Travelogues that once devoted pages to describing Tartaria were reissued with the name replaced by Siberia or Russian territory, their descriptive passages shortened or cut entirely. The few copies that retained the original wording were either locked away or left to decay in private collections. In the West, this erasure was reinforced by the publication of mass-produced educational atlases. These school editions, printed in the tens of thousands and distributed widely, contained no mention of Tartaria whatsoever. A generation raised on these maps would never suspect that, only decades earlier, those same lands had been labeled differently. Some independent researchers argue that this was no incidental byproduct of updating reference materials, but a calculated campaign. Once the name was stripped from the core body of official knowledge and the original documents relegated to restricted archives, the historical narrative could be rewritten without challenge. At that point, whatever visual evidence or oral account survived could be dismissed as anecdote or folklore, holding no authority in academic discourse. The result was that by the late 19th century, an ordinary person seeking information about Tartaria would be limited to family stories or an old book left forgotten on a private shelf. In mainstream scholarship, the term survived only as a marginal footnote, a quaint, outdated concept. The door to whatever records remained of this civilization, if it had truly existed, was now locked, the keys buried deep within archival systems well beyond the reach of most. But locking away the documents was only the first step. The next was to shape understanding at its source, through education, textbooks, and academic training, ensuring that future generations would not only forget the name, but would never think to question it at all. Restricting archival materials could frustrate independent researchers, but to ensure a name disappeared from collective memory, a more powerful tool was needed: education. Once a new generation is taught that something never existed, or is never taught about it at all, it slips into oblivion far faster than any formal censorship could achieve. By the late 19th century, the empires that controlled much of the former Tartarian lands had begun overhauling their educational systems, rewriting history and geography curricula almost from scratch. In Russia, after the reforms of Alexander II and Alexander III, official secondary school geography textbooks replaced the term Tartaria entirely with Siberia, Far East, and Russian Central Asia. The accompanying maps clearly displayed the new administrative borders, coloring each province according to the empire's governance structure. Not a single line explained that these lands had ever been called Tartaria. The name vanished from every teaching material, even in medieval or early modern history sections. In Qing China, the revision of gazetteers and educational texts produced a similar erasure. The regions of Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Manchuria were presented as administrative divisions of the Chinese realm, with their histories folded into the narrative of the Celestial Empire. Broader geographic terms that did not align with official administrative divisions were dismissed as barbarian labels and banned from formal instruction. Western powers followed the same pattern. In 19th century British, French, and German educational atlases, distributed widely across their colonies, the maps labeled the former Tartarian territories as Russian Empire or Chinese Empire. European history textbooks, when they mentioned Tatars or Mongols at all, framed them solely within the context of medieval conquests, never hinting at the possibility of a large-scale political entity that lasted into the 18th century. The change went beyond content, or it altered the delivery. New generations of students were taught that old maps and books, if they happened to encounter them, were outdated or incorrect. In some cases, teachers were explicitly instructed to explain that Tartaria was merely an old European term for nomadic tribes of the north, not a civilization or political state. This locked student understanding within a pre-approved framework, removing any incentive to investigate further. Universities and academies reinforced the shift. Theses and research papers had to use the new terminology to be accepted in academic circles. Any scholar attempting to write seriously about Tartaria risked being labeled unscientific and jeopardizing their career. The result was that by the early 20th century, virtually no one in the academic or public sphere questioned Tartaria's disappearance. From being a prominent name on international maps, it had been pushed into the realm of marginal footnotes, or reduced to a hazy historical term found only in rare old books or in archives few could access. But the rewriting process didn't stop with erasing the name. It went further, recasting the narrative of the lands once called Tartaria, assigning them a completely different past in which the central role was claimed by the current empires. And to cement that version of history on a global scale, another force was required: the academic institutions and research centers that shaped the official story and broadcast it to the world. Once textbooks had been rewritten and educational systems had collectively erased the name Tartaria, the role of academic centers became crucial. These institutions held the power to create the official memory of a civilization, or if necessary, to redefine it entirely. In the 19th century, such institutions were not only engaged in research, they also served as instruments of imperial policy, shaping historical narratives to reinforce political authority. Academies, geographical societies, and national museums in Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere possessed vast collections of artifacts and documents from lands once labeled Tartaria. Yet instead of preserving their original context, these materials were often reinterpreted within a new historical framework. A 17th century map bearing the label Great Tartaria could be displayed as evidence of Europe's geographic ignorance at the time. A piece of clothing or a technical instrument of uncertain origin might be attributed to a specific ethnic minority, divorced from the notion of a unified entity. Scholarly publications began to use the new terminology consistently: Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, Turkestan. And when referring to peoples once considered part of Tartaria, they were described as scattered, unrelated communities. Once these interpretations appeared in prestigious journals and were cited by prominent academics, they became the standard. Any dissenting view could be instantly dismissed as unscientific or labeled a conspiracy theory. Imperial governments reinforced this process by stamping their own authority onto the cultural landscape. Surviving ancient structures, even if built in the Tartarian architectural style, were renovated, adorned with contemporary national symbols, and assigned official construction dates consistent with the revised narrative. A building that may once have served as an administrative or technological hub within Tartaria's urban network could now be presented as the work of a celebrated monarch, emperor, or architect from the ruling empire. Museums, the custodians of material memory, also participated in the transformation. By arranging exhibits according to the new thematic or geographic categories, any surviving Tartarian artifacts were fragmented across multiple collections. One piece might appear in the Islamic Art Hall, another under Eurasian nomadic cultures, and others scattered between Russian history or ancient China. By slicing the narrative into unrelated parts, the concept of a unified civilization became so diluted that it was almost impossible to perceive. Even local or ethnographic studies conducted by descendants of the former Tartarian lands were rarely exempt from this control. Manuscripts that contradicted the official historical framework were often refused publication or printed in small, internal-only runs. Conversely, works that reinforced the new narrative received funding, promotion, and rapid acceptance as standard reference material. Over decades, the alliance of academic and political authority cemented a new reality. Tartaria, if it had ever existed, was now reduced to an obsolete term, a vague historical curiosity, nothing more. The fragments of the old story, maps, artifacts, architecture, still existed, but they were mislabeled, recontextualized, and scattered so thoroughly that no coherent picture could be reassembled from them. If the name Tartaria had been erased from maps and textbooks in the lands once thought to be its heartland, the memory of an ancient kingdom still survived, but in another form, in the words of the people, passed down from generation to generation. These were not stories inscribed in chronicles or carved into stone, but fragments told by the fireside, during winter festivals, or in the quiet moments of a nomadic journey across the steppe. And though each region had its own names, details, and symbols, the similarities are often uncanny. In Siberia, the Yakut and Buryat tell of the builders of cities from white stone, an ancient people who lived before the north was buried in ice. They speak of cities with tall walls, straight avenues, and round towers rising to the sky. After a great calamity, some say a sea of mud swept through, others speak of fire from the sky. The cities were abandoned, sinking into the earth or buried beneath ice and forest. In Central Asia, the oral traditions of Kazakhs and Uzbeks recall a great Khanate stretching from one sea to another, its stone-paved roads so well laid that a horse could ride for weeks without losing the way. Elders in villages still point to certain mounds or ruins and say, this was once their city gate. Many of these tales link the kingdom's fall to a flood of earth or a black wind that raged for days, followed by the arrival of new rulers. In Eastern Europe, particularly along the Volga and the Urals, old songs still speak of a northern kingdom home to monumental works that no one today knows how to build. Some versions describe its people as speaking many tongues but living under one banner and knowing the secrets of heaven and earth, a phrase modern folklorists believe could allude to astronomical knowledge or advanced engineering. What stands out is that these legends do not contradict the image of Tartaria seen in old maps and Western merchants' records. On the contrary, they fill in details missing from official history, about daily life, about the scale and connectivity of its cities, and about the sudden disaster that led to its collapse. Tales of mud floods, encroaching ice, or black winds may be collective memories of a natural catastrophe or geological event, something the mud flood theory continues to suggest. Mainstream academia often treats these legends as blends of fact and imagination or distorted memories of other historical events. Yet even with that caution, the breadth and consistency of these stories, spanning frozen Siberia, arid Central Asia, and temperate Eastern Europe, lead many independent researchers to see them as evidence of a once unified civilization linking these lands. For those searching for traces of Tartaria, these folk narratives are invaluable clues. They may not give precise coordinates or exact dates, but they point toward where to look: forgotten cities, buried structures, and lands where the collective memory has not been entirely erased. And from these fragments of memory in the 20th century would come an emerging fringe research movement, an effort to piece together the mosaic that official history had left in silence. At first, those interested in Tartaria did not call themselves researchers in the academic sense. They were journalists, engineers, architects, even soldiers stationed on remote frontiers, people who, by chance, encountered architectural ruins or old maps that most of the public ignored. A Russian engineer might stumble upon technical blueprints in a local archive for a 19th century building equipped with ventilation and heating systems more advanced than modern standards. A history teacher in Kazakhstan might pick up an 18th century French atlas at a flea market, its pages showing Great Tartaria stretching across the Eurasian landmass. What began as isolated sparks of personal curiosity gradually became the catalyst for a parallel stream of inquiry outside mainstream history. From the 1960s to 1970, as grassroots heritage movements and folk history projects spread across the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the West, those drawn to Tartaria began to find one another. They exchanged maps, photographs, oral histories, and bold hypotheses. A number of informal circles emerged, often hiding under the guise of local history clubs or antique architecture study groups, to avoid being labeled unscientific. In quiet gatherings at libraries, cafes, or private homes, they pieced together what looked like disconnected scraps into a larger, more coherent picture. In the West, with its more open academic climate, Tartaria's name occasionally reappeared in independent publications. Some historical cartography specialists in Britain and the United States published books about forgotten lands, where Tartaria was presented as a classic example of a vanished toponym. While these authors usually maintained a cautious tone, their inclusion of Tartaria in serious reference works put the name back on bookshelves, if only in niche circles. By the closing years of the 20th century, the arrival of the Internet transformed the landscape entirely. Digitized old maps, archival photographs, and open discussion forums allowed enthusiasts from around the globe to connect. Images of half-buried buildings, maps marked Great Tartaria, and excerpts from old travelogues circulated widely, examined and re-examined by online communities. Though still lacking recognition from official academia, this grassroots movement began to amass an impressive body of material, enough to make the name Tartaria, for the first time in over a century, a topic of broad and public conversation. Yet with the spread came division. Some groups approached Tartaria as a subject worthy of disciplined research, drawing on archaeological data, cartographic comparison, and architectural analysis. Others folded it into a wider web of speculative theories, from free energy technology to the idea of a global civilization erased from history, which made the narrative both more sensational and easier to dismiss as conspiracy. This ambiguity kept Tartaria balanced on the fault line between history and legend, between research and speculation. But however it was approached, one fact is undeniable. The fringe research movement saved the name Tartaria from total extinction. It ceased to be a faint annotation on a handful of antique maps and became, once again, a topic of global discussion, a challenge to historical narratives that had stood unopposed for more than a century. In the latter half of the 20th century, the fringe study of Tartaria still relied on discreet meetups, letters exchanged by post, and faded photocopies passed hand to hand. But with the dawn of the 21st century, everything changed. The Internet opened a new space where the old limits of geography, access to archives, and the size of participating circles all but disappeared. A single digitized antique map, a photograph of a building with its ground floor buried, or a page from an old textbook showing Great Tartaria, could now be accessed, downloaded, and shared with thousands of people in seconds. The first online forums dedicated to the topic began appearing in the early 2000s, often tucked away under sections labeled Alternative History or World Mysteries. There, members would post images, maps, and excerpts from old books, asking questions like, why do all maps before the 19th century label Tartaria, but none in the 20th century do? Why does the same architectural style appear across multiple continents during the same period that official history calls the construction boom? As YouTube and other video sharing platforms took off, Tartaria entered the visual arena. Videos analyzing architecture, comparing maps, or creating before and after photo montages to illustrate the mud flood hypothesis began attracting millions of views. The impact of these visuals was immediate. Viewers no longer had to imagine from written descriptions. They could see with their own eyes the half-buried windows, the antique maps, and the nearly identical buildings in cities half a world apart. Social media allowed these fragments of information to connect in ways that had never been possible. A photo of a theatre in Melbourne could be placed alongside an image of the City Hall in Kazan and a building in San Francisco, all sharing nearly identical facades and domes. An 18th century French map could be displayed next to a contemporary British atlas, showing the same consistent boundaries of Great Tartaria on both. When presented visually, such repetition created a persuasive effect far more powerful than any single article. The independent Tartaria research community also began to develop its own methods. Some specialized in analyzing satellite imagery and digital maps to hunt for traces of buried cities. Others delved deep into the online archives of national libraries, tracing each version of a map year by year to reconstruct the disappearance timeline of the name Tartaria. Certain groups focused on on-the-ground field surveys, photographing, measuring, and comparing the technical details of structures suspected to be Tartarian heritage. Yet with rapid growth came a new challenge, the thin boundary between careful research and unchecked speculation. Online, fact and fiction could stand side by side, making it easy for newcomers to be swept into exaggerated stories or weakly supported connections. Still, this same freedom allowed new hypotheses to germinate, some destined to be wrong, others potentially pointing toward lines of inquiry that mainstream history had never pursued. What is undeniable is that thanks to the Internet, Tartaria became a truly global topic. It was no longer confined to a few local history groups or antique map collectors. Now anyone could contribute a puzzle piece, a photo, a quotation, a folk story to the larger picture. And as the number of pieces grew, even the most skeptical observers had to admit that somewhere there was a story that had yet to be fully told. Once the internet had brought together Tartaria enthusiasts from around the globe, modern technology opened an entirely new avenue of investigation, one that no 18th or 19th century explorer could have imagined. The hunt for traces of this lost realm no longer relied solely on old books and antique maps. Now it could extend into the sky, using high-resolution satellite imagery, digital mapping tools, and vast online photo archives to examine lands long treated as blank spaces in official history. One of the most popular methods is overlaying old maps onto modern digital maps. When an 18th century chart marked Great Tartaria is digitally aligned with today's satellite data, researchers often find that locations once labeled as cities, fortresses, or trade hubs are now forest, grassland, or desert. In some cases, the satellite images still reveal faint geometric shapes beneath the vegetation or soil, massive straight lines or perfect circles suggesting buried foundations or defensive walls. Digital elevation models, DEM, have also become key to the investigation. In certain regions, researchers have identified unusual topographic features, long ridges or mound systems stretching for hundreds of meters, too regular in form to be entirely natural. When these patterns are compared to early 20th century photographs, they often align with places once home to settlements or monumental structures now erased from the surface. Online image archives from national libraries have proven to be a gold mine. Late 19th and early 20th century photographs of Russian, European, North American, and even Australian cities are analyzed for repeating traits: half-buried windows, domes, spires, metallic finials, or perfectly symmetrical civic squares. Placed side by side, these images reveal design similarities across cities separated by continents, reinforcing suspicions of a shared architectural network. Modern mapping tools also make it possible to retrace ancient routes. In Central Asia, satellite images show long, pale lines running with remarkable regularity across the steppe, linking points once marked as Tartarian cities. In Siberia, some of these paths cross regions that are now almost entirely uninhabited, yet from above they remain visible, raised roadways built to withstand seasonal flooding. What's remarkable is that independent researchers can accomplish all this without large budgets. With nothing more than a personal computer, an internet connection, and skill with mapping software, they've reconstructed complex schematics of suspected Tartarian city clusters, infrastructure networks, and landscape modifications. Many of these digital discoveries have led to on-the-ground expeditions, where small volunteer teams visit the sites to measure, photograph, and film, confirming what the maps suggest. Of course, this form of analysis is not without controversy. Mainstream archaeologists and geographers often argue that many of these traces are simply natural formations or remnants of unrelated local civilizations. But for proponents of the Tartaria hypothesis, the sheer repetition of certain patterns over thousands of kilometers is hard to dismiss, especially when their positions, scales, and shapes match what appears on old maps. To them, the correlation strengthens the case for a once unified urban network whose remnants still mark the Earth, visible only to those who know where and how to look. As data from satellite imagery, digital maps, and archival photo collections came together, a clearer picture began to emerge. From Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe to North and South America, Australia, and even some islands in the Pacific, structures bearing strikingly similar architectural signatures appeared like repeating motifs in a global composition. The resemblance was not limited to external style. It extended to proportions, spatial layouts, and even hidden technical features embedded deep within the buildings. The dome, the most recognizable emblem, is found everywhere. The Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, Melbourne's Town Hall, the Boston Public Library, the National Congress in Buenos Aires. Although attributed to different architects and assigned to different historical periods, all share perfectly symmetrical plans, concentric circles in their design, and domes elevated on high drums to optimize both stability and visibility. These buildings often feature spires, metallic finials, or precisely executed geometric ornamentation, details that some believe may once have served technical functions rather than purely decorative purposes. Urban layouts also follow a recurring pattern. In many cities, the central square is surrounded by 4 or 6 major buildings, connected by straight avenues that often converge on a principal domed or spired structure. This configuration appears in locations separated by tens of thousands of kilometers, with no documented history of direct interaction according to mainstream explanations. From a technical standpoint, the parallels are even more intriguing. Across continents, many old structures use the same type of tightly joined ashlar stonework, joints so fine a blade cannot fit between them, or uniformly fired bricks of remarkable consistency. Some buildings still retain underfloor heating, concealed ventilation systems, and integrated water channels, features which, if the assigned construction dates are accepted, far exceed the technological norms of their supposed era. In numerous cases, the ground floors or foundations reveal building techniques completely different from the upper portions, suggesting that the current structure was erected upon a much older base, something some researchers believe to be direct Tartarian heritage. Proponents of the unified global civilization hypothesis argue that such coincidences are too great to be accidental. They suggest that before being fractured by natural disasters or political upheaval, a global urban and architectural network existed, sharing standardized design principles and technological knowledge. When this network collapsed, possibly in the 18th or 19th century, its surviving structures were repurposed and given new origin stories tailored to local historical narratives. Mainstream academia offers a different explanation, attributing these similarities to the global spread of popular late modern styles such as neoclassicism, Byzantine revival, or Beaux-Arts, transmitted via trade, colonization, and cultural exchange. But for independent researchers, this fails to account for the matching internal technical details, the kind of engineering that is far harder to copy convincingly than exterior ornamentation. This global architectural comparison, while not yet definitive proof, has compelled many to look at Tartaria through a radically different lens. From being just a fading name on old maps, it now sits at the center of a much larger proposition, that there may once have been a civilization with an urban, architectural, and technological network spanning the planet, and that it was erased from the official historical record in less than 2 centuries. As a result, the focus is no longer merely on spotting the architectural parallels, but on their impact on historical thinking. If these correspondences are genuine, they challenge the very metrics by which we measure progress. The next question is no longer do they look alike, but how does this disrupt the entire framework of history as we know it? If the Tartaria hypothesis holds true, the tidy ladder of linear historical progress must be dismantled. Our trajectory may not have been a steady climb from primitive to advanced, but a cyclical pattern of reaching peaks and then collapsing, leaving behind fragmented, disconnected memories. In that light, the milestones we use to measure advancement would have to be recalibrated. For example, we often associate global urbanization, standardized architecture, and intercontinental trade networks with the post-industrial revolution era. But if such a network had already existed centuries earlier, sustained by another civilization, many of our modern achievements might simply be repetitions in a new guise. This reframing also changes how we view other ancient civilizations. If Tartaria could be erased from history, then it is plausible that other civilizations, perhaps in Africa, South America, or Southeast Asia, met similar fates. Each new discovery of a structure that doesn't match the technical level assigned to its era would no longer be treated as an isolated anomaly, but as further evidence of a broader pattern. That mainstream history represents only a narrow slice of a far larger story. Such a hypothesis directly challenges the credibility of the disciplines that study the past, from archaeology and anthropology to historical geology. If a civilization as vast and interconnected as Tartaria could be omitted or erased, then to what extent are our methods of collecting, verifying, and preserving historical data flawed? How many pieces of evidence have been reinterpreted to fit the dominant narrative? And are we imposing a preconceived evolutionary path onto historical fragments that refuse to follow it? Another consequence lies in the realm of social psychology. The linear model of development provides a sense of stability and direction. The comforting belief that humanity is always moving forward, learning from the past to avoid repeating mistakes. But if history is actually a series of rises and collapses, then present prosperity offers no guarantee, and the risk of losing the entire foundation of our civilization is ever present. Acknowledging this possibility can be unsettling, but it can also inspire greater caution, humility, and respect toward the past. Broadening the perspective, Tartaria's challenge to linear progress invites a different approach. History as a multidimensional flow in which civilizations can coexist, overlap, and succeed one another in non-linear ways. In this framework, truth doesn't lie in a single authoritative narrative, but in the willingness to embrace multiple layers of memory, multiple possibilities, and the vast gaps we have yet to fill. If, one day, the memory of Tartaria were restored with solid evidence, proving it was once a unified civilization with advanced architecture and technology, the consequences would reach far beyond the shelves of libraries and museum halls. Such a revelation would strike directly at the foundations of the world's political, cultural, and cognitive order. First, many nations would face difficult questions about the legitimacy of their own national histories. If parts of their territory once belonged to a larger, interconnected civilizational network, then claims of independent origin or unbroken historical continuity would need re-examination. This would not merely be a matter of prestige, it would touch on borders, ownership of heritage, and even rights to natural resources in regions long claimed as part of the current state's foundational history. Next, restoring the memory of Tartaria could directly challenge the legitimacy of the empires that once helped erase its name from the map. If evidence showed that Tartaria's disappearance was the result of a deliberate campaign involving redrawn maps, renamed regions, and rewritten history, then those powers would face political and moral pressure. In today's climate, where historical accountability is increasingly demanded, such revelations could lead to calls for formal apologies, restitution, or at the very least official acknowledgement. The impact would also extend to culture and religion. A global civilization with a shared system of symbols, architectural forms, and technical knowledge could undermine local religious narratives or mythologies closely tied to regional history. If symbols thought to be unique to Europe, Asia, or the Americas all stemmed from a common origin, many belief systems would have to adapt to this new reality. Economically, official recognition of Tartaria would make its architectural heritage and related archaeological sites subjects of global research, preservation, and tourism. This could bring immense benefits, but also intense disputes over management and exploitation rights. Who would be responsible for safeguarding monuments scattered across dozens of countries, yet all belonging to the legacy of a lost civilization? Finally, perhaps the most profound change would be in global consciousness. Acknowledging that a civilization like Tartaria once existed and was erased from memory would make the public re-evaluate the trustworthiness of official narratives. Skepticism toward established institutions, from academia to governments, would likely grow, fueling a greater appetite for independent investigation. This could lead to a more engaged and self-reliant society in historical inquiry, but it also carries the risk of fragmented understanding as different groups reinterpret the past in competing ways. And if such a moment came, the most pressing question for each of us would be, how do we distinguish between the truths newly uncovered and the replacement stories crafted to fill the void? To answer that question, what we need first is not to choose sides, but to apply the ability to verify the critical thinking. This does not demand that we instantly believe an appealing story, nor does it require us to dismiss every inconvenient trace. It asks us to stand in the middle ground, cross-checking sources, connecting evidence, and being ready to adjust our conclusions as new data emerges. In the case of Tartaria, this means not rushing to fully accept the erased civilization narrative simply because it is captivating, but also not ignoring the visual evidence, archival records, and persistent parallels in folk traditions. Accepting possibilities outside the mainstream does not mean rejecting official history altogether. Instead, it opens a space where parallel narratives can exist, alternative versions of the past that may not yet be fully verified but are strong enough to raise questions and spur further investigation. It is within this space that new ideas, unexpected discoveries, and previously unconsidered perspectives have the chance to emerge. Tartaria is a prime example of how historical knowledge is not a fixed monolith, but a vast patchwork in which individual pieces can be replaced, altered, or newly added. Seeing history in this way teaches us that the search for truth is not a journey to a single endpoint, but an ongoing process of expanding and refining the picture. Critical thinking also protects us from the trap of romanticizing the past. Some who encounter the Tartaria hypothesis may be swept up by the vision of a perfect, peaceful, and technologically superior civilization. Yet if it truly existed, Tartaria would have had its flaws, conflicts, inequalities, and limitations, like any complex society. Maturity in understanding comes from seeing both sides rather than replacing one idealized story with another. Ultimately, embracing possibilities outside mainstream history is not just a matter for scholars or researchers. It is a social and personal skill in an age overflowing with information and misinformation. The ability to question, trace the origins of data, compare multiple viewpoints, and adjust our stance when new evidence emerges will be crucial to avoiding being swept away by narratives crafted with intent. If Tartaria offers us a lesson, it is not only that a great civilization may have been forgotten, but also that any story can be forgotten if we do not preserve the habit of questioning and seeking truth. And in a world still filled with historical gaps, maintaining critical thinking and an open mind will be the key to safeguarding humanity's memory against the erosion of time, and against the hands that would shape it to their own design. When I think of that memory, I see Tartaria as a vast silhouette in the desert of our collective mind, smothered beneath a thick layer of time's dust and deliberate forgetting. Each time someone patiently brushes away a bit of that dust, a new contour emerges. A dome, a straight avenue, a yellowed scrap of map. Each fragment hinting that the picture beneath is broader, more intricate, and far stranger than we have been taught to believe. Through this entire journey, from antique maps bearing Great Tartary to half-buried buildings, to the folk legends that refuse to fade, to satellite images and digital overlays, each recovered piece seems to push back against centuries of silence. And yet, they also reveal the enormity of the task. Restoring a memory that may have been erased on purpose is not only an archaeological or historical challenge, it is a direct confrontation with the very structures of power that built the wall to hide it. And so the largest question still hangs there like a cloud that refuses to dissipate. If one day undeniable evidence of Tartaria were revealed, would the world dare to face it? Would we be ready to rewrite whole chapters of global history, to accept that much of what we've trusted for generations was only part of the story? Or would we react as many civilizations have before, clinging to the old account because it is safer, more familiar, and less disruptive to the order we know? It is possible that the truth of Tartaria, while if it exists, would bring a wave of excitement, opening the door to a new era of research, rekindling a dormant spirit of inquiry. But it could just as easily bring chaos, division, and conflict, as present-day power structures feel threatened, and boundaries, not just on maps but in the human mind, are called into question. Amid all those possibilities, one certainty remains. The story of Tartaria, whether fact or legend, is a mirror held up to the complex relationship between humanity and memory. It shows us that we are not only products of history, but also its authors, sometimes preserving truth, sometimes burying it deeper. And each generation, looking at the dust-covered silhouette of Tartaria, must decide for itself: will it let the figure remain forgotten, or will it dare to dig deeper no matter what might be found? Perhaps that question is Tartaria's truest legacy, a reminder that truth never walks into the light on its own. It appears only when someone has the patience, the courage, and the readiness to face it, even if the answer shakes the very ground beneath everything they thought they knew.